So let's talk about something that's on a lot of our minds as we get older. Is experiencing more pain just inevitable? It seems like it should be, right? Well, a massive new global study took a hard look at this question, and the answer they found is way more complex and honestly, a lot more interesting than you might think. It's just a common assumption, isn't it? The years go by, the aches start to add up. It feels like a law of nature. But what if it's not? What if the amount of pain we feel as we age has less to do with our biology and a whole lot more to do with where we live and even how we live? All right, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with why pain is such a huge global problem in the first place. Then we'll get into how on earth the researchers managed to track it across the world. After that, the core findings, what they actually discovered. We'll also look at who's carrying the heaviest burden here, what the study can't tell us, and finally, the big takeaway. Okay, first things first, why even do a global study on pain? I mean, pain feels like the most personal thing in the world, right? Well, it turns out that when you add up all that personal suffering, it becomes a massive public health and economic issue. Let's just start with the money. In some countries, the total cost of chronic pain, think healthcare, lost workdays, all of it, can eat up as much as 4% of the entire economy. That is an absolutely staggering figure. Beyond the economics, there's the human cost, which is just immense. Pain is the #1 reason people live with disability across the globe. It affects quality of life more than cancer, diabetes, and heart disease combined. It's not a side issue, it's a central one. So how in the world do you measure something as personal and subjective as pain, not just in one place, but all over the planet? Well, the researchers behind this study pulled off a pretty monumental effort to get a really clear apples-to-apples comparison. To get that clear picture, they needed a ton of data, and they got it. The study included, get this, more than 212,000 people over the age of 50. The sheer size of this thing is what gives its findings so much power. And this wasn't just focused on one part of the world either. They managed to pull together and harmonize data from 22 different countries. This gives us this incredibly rare window into how pain is experienced in totally different cultures, societies, and healthcare systems. Now, this is the really crucial part. This wasn't just a one-time survey. It was a longitudinal study. That means they followed the same people over a long period of time, in this case, up to 2 decades. That is the gold standard, because it lets you see how things are actually changing over time, not just a single snapshot. All right, so all that massive effort, all that data, what did it show? Well, the main finding is pretty clear, and for most of the world, it's pretty concerning. First, let's just get a baseline. If you pull all the data from all the countries over all the years, a jaw-dropping 43% of people over 50 said they were often troubled by pain. That's almost 1 out of every 2 people. But this is where it gets really fascinating. The researchers zoomed in on the decade between 2006 and 2016, and a very clear pattern emerged. In most of the countries, 15 out of the 22, the number of people reporting pain went up significantly. But in one country, China, it actually went down. And look, this wasn't some tiny little blip. In those 15 countries where pain was on the rise, it went up by an average of 12.1 percentage points. So let me put that into perspective. If a country started at, say, 40% of people in pain, a decade later it was over 52%. That is a huge societal shift in just 10 years. So we have this rising global average, which is alarming enough. But, averages can hide a lot of the real story. And when you dig into the data, you see that the burden of all this pain is not being shared equally at all. Across the board, there's a really clear gap between men and women. Women were just significantly more likely to report being in pain. We're talking an 11 percentage point difference when you look at all the data together. And we see a very similar story when we look at education. Folks with lower levels of education reported much higher rates of pain. And here the gap is even bigger, over 12 percentage points. It really points to a powerful socioeconomic divide. But here is what's so telling, and I think this is the most important part. How big these gaps are, it changes dramatically from country to country. For example, Denmark had some of the smallest gaps. South Korea, on the other hand, had the largest. Just look at the difference in pain between men and women. In Austria, it's pretty small, less than 4 points. But in South Korea, it's a whopping 23 points. That variation is a huge clue that these gaps aren't purely biological, they're shaped by society. Okay, before we get to the final takeaway, we have to talk about what this study can't tell us. This is so important. Being a good scientist, or even just a good consumer of science, means being honest about the limits of the data. So first, this is an observational study. It's fantastic at showing us what is happening, spotting these big trends and connections. But it can't prove cause and effect. It can't tell us definitively why pain is increasing. Second, the data is all based on self-reports, people saying they're troubled by pain. That doesn't tell us the location or the cause or how bad it is. That's really important context to remember. So, after digging through all of this data, the trends, the gaps, the limitations, what's the bottom line? What does this all mean for us? Well, this is where we need to make a really big shift in how we think about pain. Honestly, this quote from the researchers themselves just nails it. The trends are too big, the disparities are too consistent and too wide for us to keep treating this as a collection of separate individual problems. This is a public health crisis that needs public health solutions. And this is the most hopeful and powerful takeaway from the entire study. The fact that China saw pain go down, the fact that Denmark has such small gaps between groups, that is proof. It proves that a future with more pain is not inevitable. It's not a biological certainty. It means that our policies, our social safety nets, our environments, they all matter, a lot. So we have to end with this question. If rising pain isn't just a fact of life, but a direct result of the kind of societies we build, that changes everything. It moves us away from just thinking about managing symptoms individually and forces us to ask a much bigger, much more important question. What can we change about our world to prevent so much of this pain from happening in the first place?